these are our notes for section 1 of chapter 11. Chapter 11 itself is about evolution of populations, but section 1 is pretty quick, pretty easy. We're going to describe the significance of genetic variation within a population, and then also where does that genetic variation come from? Talk about the sources of that genetic variation. All right, so a couple definitions to start off here. Gene pool is the combined alleles of all the individuals in a population. The idea here is that hopefully that gene pool is not too shallow. You need a lot of variation in populations to be able to evolve like we're talking about in general. So the more variation, the better, right? The more different kinds of genes you have in that population, the better. Allele frequency is measuring, okay, how common is a certain allele, some individual allele in that population. So we're going to talk a lot about allele frequencies and how it might make a difference if it's a dominant or a recessive allele for that trait. So this first question, asking which type of allele is more common in a population, dominant or recessive, right? It's actually a really complicated question, and it really depends on the situation. So it's easier to explain first just by looking at an example specifically. So you'll need a little explanation here. We're assuming that this is a population of frogs, right? There's a picture in your book that looks something like this and has labels with it. But we're going to say that that big G is for green. So when I look at all of these frogs, right, as long as there's at least one big G, right, it doesn't really matter what the second one is, that frog is going to be green. And I can look through pretty quickly and decide, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 green frogs, right? And then there'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 that are apparently brown. Since I just told you, now you know. Little g is for that brown color. So if you look at this population, right, 6 frogs are green, 4 frogs are brown. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, just because there are 6 green frogs and 60% of that population is green, doesn't mean that that green allele is the most frequently occurring allele in that population. So this can tend to be kind of misleading. So although most of the frogs, right, or at least 2 more than not, are green, most of the alleles in this population are actually brown. If I count out the alleles alone, if I'm just counting lowercase g's, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of those little g's. And there are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 capital G alleles, right? So actually there are more recessive alleles than dominant alleles. But again, because dominant takes over, right, it actually looks like there are more dominant alleles in this population. Usually when you look at a population, you just get to see what color the frog is. You don't get to know what genotype that frog has. You don't know if it's going to be homozygous dominant, big G, or if it's going to be heterozygous, big G, little g. You just know that there's more green frogs than brown frogs. So a lot of times we assume that there are more green alleles than brown alleles, but that's not necessarily true. In fact, the opposite was true in this case. In terms of allele frequency, 60% of the alleles in this population are actually brown, only 40% are green, but that 40% down here turned into a 60% up here. 40% of the alleles are green. Excuse me, let me mark that appropriately. But 60% of the population have that green trait, right? So these stats can tend to be misleading. Just because you see more green doesn't mean that green is the most frequently occurring allele, right? But sometimes it will be. So it really depends on the situation, right? When I try to answer this question, which type of allele is more common, I actually usually say neither, or it depends on the situation. And in order to answer this appropriately on a test, you're going to have to use an example. You're going to have to use more than one example. An example we could use that we talked about before is in human blood types. So I don't know if you remember me talking about this, but I told you that most of you have type O blood. And O, in that case, that type O is the recessive trait, right? So O is the most common allele in our population, and it would have to be the most common allele in our population for that to be true. Again, when something's recessive, if there are more recessive phenotypes than dominant phenotypes, that means that there are a lot more recessive alleles than dominant alleles. So just for that example alone, okay, O is the most common allele. I just wrote most allele. I meant most common allele, obviously. Whereas on the flip of that, most of us have O positive blood, right? I don't have O positive blood, but most people in our population have O positive blood. And positive is the most common Rh factor. But positive was actually dominant in that case. So just in this one example alone, the majority of the people in this country have O positive blood, and that O is a recessive trait and the positive is a dominant trait. So it really depends on the context. Sometimes dominant traits are more common, sometimes recessive traits. So you could use an example like this, or you could use a lot of different examples. One example I use frequently, although it may or may not actually be accurate, right? When we think of Nordic countries, when we think of places like Sweden, most people there have blonde hair, right? And now that may or may not actually be true. But in order to have a large frequency of blonde hair, you actually have to have a disproportionately large, extremely large allele frequency for that blonde, right? Because remember, if that recessive phenotype is more common than the dominant, it has to outweigh it even more in terms of allele frequency. So blondes in Sweden versus if you look at a population like there is in Japan, most people have black hair, right? And black is definitely dominant, especially to blonde, right? So it would depend on a population there. You could use two different examples like that. Now again, that's also bordering on, I don't know if that's completely true. I'm pretty sure that the most common allele in Sweden is blonde, but that may be different or may be inaccurate information. So I like to use the human blood type example because it's one example and it explains both things, right? O is the most common trait and it's a recessive one. Positive is the most common trait and it's a dominant one. More alleles are O in our population than anything else. More alleles are positive in our population than anything else. So you can have both answers in the same example. Otherwise, genetic variation comes from multiple sources. That's another main point in this section. Just try to remember that mutations are actually a source of new traits in a population. Right? And the more traits you have, the better. Because remember, those traits, right? We talked about this before, mutations in general, right? They could be bad, they might be good. More likely than not, they're not going to matter, right? But when it comes down to it, in terms of a population, right? Even though some of those mutations are bad, that doesn't really matter because that doesn't affect the population. If they're really bad, then that individual won't survive. And it doesn't affect the rest of the population. It doesn't get passed on to that next generation. right? Whereas if that trait instead is good, obviously that's going to benefit the population, and that's going to be a more frequently occurring trait in future generations, right? Again, most don't matter. But when I say that most of them don't matter, that just means that most of them don't matter right now. They could matter very much so in the future, right? With changing environments, some of those that don't matter may end up being bad, right? Some of those that don't matter may end up becoming good. And that good trait, that adaptation, could help that population in the long run. So again, you have options for mutations, but generally speaking, for populations, mutations are always good because they allow a population to evolve. They allow that species to change with their changing environment, right? Even though for an individual, mutations can be bad, right? For a population, they'd be good. Recombination, we just need to know that that's talking about sexual reproduction generally. And that's important because we learned that sexual reproduction shuffles those traits that are in that population so that all individuals are unique, so that they all have that ability to change, right? They may or may not have that adaptation that's necessary, but at least it's there somewhere in that population. Otherwise, the last couple questions in this section are not necessarily new. When I ask about why are mutations in non-reproductive cell sources of genetic variation, right, that's the same answer it always was, right? Remember, only mutations in sex cells can be passed on. Right? Whereas, why does genetic variation increase the chance that some individuals in a population will survive? Right? That comes down to the fact that if all individuals are exactly the same, then when the environment changes, they all die, right? If one can't cope, none can cope. So we talk about how we need that huge variation. We need a lot of variation because that variation allows for more traits to choose from. So if one of those traits happens to be an adaptation, happens to be useful, that's going to help that species evolve. That's going to help that species change, right, with its changing environment. So the more traits you have, the better. That just gives you more to choose from. All right, so that should be good.